This episode of the Media Leader podcast was edited by our production partner, Trisonic, a results-focused agency that plans and buys all audio media. Check them out at trisonic.co.uk. That's trisonic.co.uk.
I mean, even things like critical skills and critical thinking, and we think, well, we still need the human in the loop to make those decisions. Completely disagree. I think that actually the human in the loop with the AI is still better than just the human in the loop.
Welcome to the Media Leader podcast. I'm Jack Benjamin. Next month, my colleagues and I will be up in Manchester for the Future of Media Manchester event, part one of our two-part flagship event series, with the other held in London in November. Among speakers like effectiveness expert Peter Field, Newsworks' Heather Dancy, Channel 4's Mark Watts, and representatives from all the major media holding groups, we'll be looking to unpack an industry in flux. How is AI changing the media market? What's next for social platforms, for brand discovery? How can we supercharge investment outside of London? These are all questions we'll be digging into live in Manchester, and we'll have full coverage of the event on the Media Leader. But ahead of the conference, I wanted to catch up with one of the speakers who offers a unique view on our industry. Professor Andy Miah is Chair in Science Communication and Future Media at the University of Salford. He is a bioethicist, an academic, and an expert on how technology is shaping our media environments and, in turn, shaping who we are and how we interact with each other in society. I wanted to prod Miah on some of the big questions facing our industry. We spoke about the ways in which AI has the power to transform media for the better and for the worse, how AI slop is taking over our TikTok feeds, the ethics of chatbots, and whether business incentives are aligning with social incentives for technological change in media. This is our conversation. I hope you enjoy. Andy Miah, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
I wanted to start by knowing a little bit more about you. Obviously, you're an academic, but what drew you to the subject of media and technology in academia?
Well, I guess it was beginning my PhD many years ago now, the beginning of two major revolutions. One was the genetic revolution and the other was the digital. And I couldn't ignore either of them. So tried to write about each and increasingly write about their connections too. So everything I write about is focused on really the emerging technologies and how they affect humanity. So media, of course, is a critical technology of our times and constantly reshapes how we think about ourselves, how we relate to each other. And it's just deeply fascinating to me. So yeah, stuck in the field.
And how would you characterize the moment we're in right now in terms of how technology is shaping our media consumption?
I think it's really fascinating to look at the last sort of 20 years of the growth of social media, the transformation of our whole media culture to where we are right now, where AI is influencing so much of what we talk about. It feels like every single day a new platform, a new capability comes out that is going to put into question everything we've done before. So it feels like we're a bit of a schizophrenia, I would say, about optimism for the future, but also anxiety about often sort of job transitions, which I think is a critical part of this conversation. But I'm very much an optimist with technology. I think it's incredibly empowering when used well, and try to spend a lot of my time encouraging people to do just that.
We'll definitely talk about AI in a lot of detail in a moment. You mentioned you're an optimist. Given that, what would you say daunts you most about the moment that we're in? Is it the sort of job uncertainty?
Actually, it's much more fundamental than that. I think it's the loss of opportunity by not seizing it early enough and understanding it well enough. A lot of my time has been spent trying to communicate the possibilities of new technology to wide audiences. And I'm always struck by just how much new tech is not available or not used by so many people. So for me, the biggest anxiety is actually not making it available to enough people to really allow everyone to be part of this. It reminds me back of Sir Tim Berners-Lee, the founder of the World Wide Web, where he, at the end of his sort of mission statement for its future, said, "This is for everyone." And I think for me, that's critical in these times, especially when the transformation possibilities are so exciting. They're so destabilizing, and I think disruptive, that it could really transform the entire sort of media economy over the next 20 years if we do it well.
And when you say available to everyone, do you mean globally that there are lots of people? I mean, there's still lots of people, billions of people without internet access.
Absolutely. And I think that's a really critical part of this conversation. I work a lot with organizations that are global in nature. We have one called the World Technology Games, and we're trying to make sure that innovation is available to everybody and it involves everybody. I think we need a lot more things like that. There's so many fundamental human challenges that we are much better working together on than separately. So for me, it is about international collaboration. It is about availability of technology, but it's also about literacy as well and making sure people understand and can be part of that new community of users that are out there. It's a huge, and I think back when the internet started, it was sort of talked about as the digital divide and this idea that we need to make it available. I think that project is an endless project. It's not something we can expect to solve and then get on with the rest of our lives. It's actually an ongoing part of our society, and that's the sort of depth of engagement we need to think about when trying to make a change.
Mm. Do you worry that the internet is becoming less open, especially with, say, the passing of the Online Safety Act and the sort of certainly a movement to age gate different parts of the internet, and obviously the age verification technology is still in its relative infancy. So I'm curious what you make of that trend.
I think that we have to be constantly vigilant of how media generally is at risk in all sorts of ways, whether it is the diminishing investment and resource around investigative journalism, or whether it's access to the internet quite broadly, or indeed the sort of walled gardens that we find ourselves in that push back content that sort of responds to our own feelings. These sorts of concerns, I think, are very much at the heart of my anxieties about the future. I think we can't take for granted the media freedom that we enjoy. We need to be vigilant about these things. And actually, a big part of that is empowering people to understand the technology and how to use it well. And that's why, for me, one of my big sort of missions has been trying to make sure that we think about and promote digital literacy at a very early age to allow people to feel empowered, to feel that this is for them. It's not just something to scroll through content. It's actually something to create, to empower, to do really remarkable things. And I think that has to be at the heart of both how we think about ourselves as a kind of community of educators, but also as a society at large.
You mentioned the walled gardens, and the most dominant tech companies of our era, the Googles, Metas, Microsofts, many others, have actually been criticized as not necessarily having the consumer at the heart of all of their decisioning. Sort of the idea that the consumers and their data are really the product that they're selling to advertisers is central to the theory of enshittification that's become quite popular over the past couple of years. I'm curious what you make of that argument.
I think that's a really credible argument, especially when you look at the typical ways in which people use media. And actually, one of my aspirations is to get people to think about a sort of 30-70 split percentage-wise, where they spend at least 30% of their time scrolling through stuff, perhaps, but then more 70% creating and making stuff. I think the antidote to being locked into those systems is actually to be a producer, to be someone that creates, to be someone that innovates. And of course, you're still reliant on the platforms. But what I have found is that when you take people on that creative journey, you also allow them to open up their minds to other places, other sorts of applications, other sorts of experiences, and to look beyond just their typical places where they doom scroll through content. So for me, it is about agency and trying to look beyond. And actually, that's for me fundamental to being part of our media culture. It's not just being locked into. I mean, back in years ago, it'd be locked into a newspaper that you read only one newspaper. And I think for me, you have to take a kind of agnostic view on where is it you find your source of inspiration and look quite broadly. And that's a habit that requires changing, and it's not easy because it's people get very habitualized into their preferred environments.
Are platforms good patrons for creatives, would you say?
I think sometimes they are. Sometimes they go through changes that I think lead them to be less so. I think certainly one of the things that I've noticed, even with platforms like TikTok, to some extent Instagram, but over the years, they've gone through different sort of functions and uses for people and meanings for people. I remember there's still quite a lot of Instagram users that still think of it as this photographic platform that's there for the creative stuff. But of course, we can see how the business model behind these has led us towards a whole different kind of experience. And I think that's something we do need to be vigilant of, and sort of mindful of. One of my big sort of predictions is that Google Maps is going to be the kind of metaverse that takes over everything else, because of course they're absorbing so much into that platform. And you've seen this over the last few years, increasing visibility of brand logos, increasing advertising going into it, and the beginnings of immersive map experiences that of course are very much like gaming worlds, whether it's Fortnite or Minecraft. These are becoming playable experiences. So I think we do have to keep an eye on how the platforms evolve and ask a lot of the developers along the way.
You mentioned the metaverse, and it's not actually a topic that we've talked about much in the past, maybe a year and a half, 2 years. Obviously, very big hype cycle in terms of Meta spending billions and billions of dollars and renaming the company Meta when it was pushing in this direction. And this was sort of peak COVID. NFTs were a big thing. Crypto was a big thing. I suppose that still is, but the other two, metaverse, NFTs, not so much. How do we discern the hype, especially the short-term hype, from maybe some of these longer-term developments that you might be suggesting are still working in the background?
It's a great question. And one of my anxieties is that we often just look at the very recent past to determine what we think the future will look like. And I think that's a really fundamental mistake. And in fact, it's not surprising we do that because, of course, we scroll through content that is 15 seconds. It's very short content. We don't tend to look back at things. And I think that's a real challenge with society more generally, is actually our attention to the past. I remember back when Google Glass was launched nearly 13 years ago now, I think it was, and again, went through a similar sort of hype cycle and eventually sort of crashed and didn't lead to any great adoption. But the legacy of some of these innovations is really remarkable. There are smart glasses all over the place now. And I think that actually we can look quite productively at the hype cycle of the metaverse. And in my mind, still kind of go back to Neil Stephenson's book where he kind of came up with this idea and think, well, what is the natural course of how technology is going to evolve and what do we want from it? And actually, I think we do want to have those more immersive experiences that are full body, that are completely aligned with how we typically operate in the world. And the metaverse is still a term that for me responds to that dream, if you like, to see if we can have that integration. And we see examples of it in different ways, but I'm convinced that it's still around us. And actually, it may not be called that as much as it used to be, but it's still a big part of how we think about the interoperability of digital platforms. And increasingly so. I think even the sort of shift from UGC to UGG, user-generated gaming worlds, is a big part of that people want to feel that they're having a three-dimensional experience of digital, not just one that's a 2D scroll through things. And that's it's better. I mean, it's why gaming is doing so well, is because it's fully immersive. It's something that draws you in, feels like you're part of a narrative, you're part of a story that matters to you. And it's more compelling. And I think that's what the metaverse ought to be. And we're not quite there yet, I think, with it, but it's growing very quickly. And you look at the attention to gaming that's happening over the range of sort of media assets that we see. And I think it's even LinkedIn's doing gaming. It's crazy.
Yeah, everything's getting gamified. Do you think advertisers are leaning into gamification more? Should they be leaning into it more than they are?
I think that it's critical that they do lean into it. And I remember just a couple of months ago, it was a new miniseries that was being launched in Disney. It was a Star Wars series that then was premiering its sort of first episode in Fortnite. And it was a really interesting example because as you walked around this kind of playable level in Fortnite, wherever you were, you had a screen built into the architecture of the world, and it will be streaming the video that you wanted to watch. So it's an evolution of having like a dual screen experience where you've got Fortnite on your main screen and animation on your other mobile device, to having the two integrated. And for me, those are great examples of that integration that is a bigger part of I think the future of media. So the gaming world is giving a glimpse into some of the behavioral changes that we see, especially in young users, and the expectations they have to not just be single screen, but actually playable experiences. And absolutely critical to understand and be a part of. And then again, to go back to your earlier question about the biggest risks are not immersing ourselves into these trends to understand the behavior change that's taking place around them, because the knock-on effect of that is a transformation to the expectations of consumers. And if you don't get that right, you lose your audience.
I wonder if a big risk is also the specific people that are often leading these companies that are taking us into the future. Carol Cadwalder has coined the term broligarchs, which is sort of the personal interests of these tech CEOs are often criticized. And I'm curious, do you worry about the personal incentives among some of the wealthiest people in the world aligning with the consumer interests of everyone else?
How could you not worry about that? I think it's critical that we sort of keep an eye on these things, not least because they obviously have impacts beyond their sector. And when we see, especially people get involved with things like politics, things like the funding of innovation, and then underpinning all aspects of innovation, it's quite concerning from a sort of monopoly perspective, but also in terms of how it restricts our ability to realize even more remarkable things. I remember when OpenAI was sort of doing very well at the beginning of this year, actually, and then sort of had DeepSeek come out, and it was sort of then confronting it. It's a great example of how you need that competition to push the boundaries of I suppose these reigns of the brand. I've heard that term oligarch before, but it's a great term because it also draws attention to the gendered aspect of this as well. I think there's a real concern about how much we put people on a pedestal when there's so much that sits alongside it. And I think that we do have to be anxious about the degree to which any new kind of innovative creation can be absorbed by a kind of a pariah really that is wanting to take it on. And I think the anxiety of a startup becoming a feature in another product is very much at the forefront of my mind when I work a lot with SMEs. We have a centre called the Media City Immersive Technologies Innovation Hub here in Manchester, and that's a great example of where you see the creative sector trying to figure out how to remain empowered creatively, but then not fall sort of prey to these bigger companies.
I do want to talk to you about AI, and not just because it's been such a hot topic for the industry, for the world for 3 years now, but because it's arguably shaping the marketing industry faster than most others at the moment. We're seeing it in job losses. We're seeing it being used by broadcasters to make cheaper advertisements. We're seeing AI slop all over our TikTok feeds. Creators are starting to sell their likenesses for a cheap buck, which are then hawking God knows what product. And Mark Zuckerberg also can't stop talking about superintelligence recently, which is very interesting. It's not clear exactly, I think, how that's being defined, certainly from a product standpoint. So it's a lot to take in. And I actually want to ask you about practically all these one at a time. But first, what do you make of the current place where we are with regard to AI? Are we prepared as a global society for how it's developing?
I don't think we are ever fully prepared for the scale of transformation that a remarkable new technology like AI is going to bring and is already bringing. And I think what we see at the moment is lots of sectors scrambling to work out what that means for them, whether it's marketing or indeed education. You know, we have conversations about, is the essay dead? Is the long form written assessment dead? And these are kind of fundamental building blocks of society to work out how do we attach meaning to the material that people generate. And I think that certainly that is huge. I think that I remember a few months ago, there was a lot of conversation about people saying please and thank you to ChatGPT.
Right.
And Sam Altman sort of came on and talked about how much money that costs to do that, how much resource it requires for people to be polite. And it struck me at the time that on the one hand, it's great that people are more polite than rude, but nevertheless, I think it's also an example of a very early stage behavioral tendency in the era of AI. I think that increasingly those behaviors will transform very dramatically in ways that are still yet relatively misunderstood, or at least lacking in understanding. I think that and we've got a whole new sociology of artificial intelligence emerging around that I think is, again, when I think about marketing, when I think about a whole range of sectors, coming to terms with their new sociological realities of AI is absolutely fundamental. If you don't get that, then it's very hard to be able to foresee and predict and resource the transformation. So I think it is important to not underestimate just how much this is changing things. But the key thing for me is then, what do you put in place to make sure that people can come to terms with that shift, but also feel part of it, rather than feel like it's happening to them by some outside force. And I think we do have stories that do tell us this. We need to elevate them a lot more, like understand the sort of nuances of how people are using the technology. But I think also understand how people are responding to it as well. This idea that I remember even 5 years ago, people sort of laughed at the idea of a kind of virtual influencer. No one would want to have a relationship with an AI. And of course, we see that happening in lots of different ways, whether it's the possibility of having an AI doctor or having a therapist. These are all becoming desirable features of our media life. And I think that although that there is an element of that feels very strange, I think that when people find use in it, it becomes incredibly natural and actually a part of a rich part of their life. So making sense of that is fundamental.
The thing that I worry about, that I find problematic, is that the incentive structure for the businesses that might be creating the AI doctor or the AI therapist or the AI girlfriend, boyfriend, wife are different from what the consumer might want, which is to say that basically these companies will want users to spend as much time with their products as possible. That's why you have the sort of OpenAI ChatGPT model where it is constantly complimenting you, making you feel heard and seen, and ways in which that probably people don't get a lot of in their day-to-day lives necessarily from the people they interact with. It's almost a level of addiction that's being designed within the model, and that I think is probably reasonably concerning, especially given that, I mean, this is not real life that necessarily we're talking about in terms of a real life interaction. So how do you handle that sociological change if people are interacting with these chatbots that aren't designed for their benefit, but designed for the company's benefit?
Well, it's really interesting because I think a lot of people, when they open up a GPT or some sort of platform that they interact with in a way that they feel is quite open, it's not a closed loop system where it's feeding back to you sort of kind of predefined answers. There's a perception of anything could happen here, and of course we can see that there's a congeniality within many of these platforms. They don't want conflict. They don't want to, certainly won't get into controversial issues very easily. But again, I would say that we're still very early on in this journey. I think that increasingly, AI is becoming a kind of secondary inner voice that people have, that they can critically kind of bounce ideas off, and that becomes part of their mindset as well. It's something that becomes indistinguishable from the rest of their lives. I think that's something that is a part of this process. And I think the only sort of antidote to being locked into the system and being limited by it is, again, to explore multiple platforms, to be sort of polyamorous in your use of AI, if you like, to make sure you don't feel too locked into one particular system. And like you could say, I guess, that they all have their particular desire to make sure you're part of their ecosystem for as much as possible. And I think we do, and it's interesting because I think that we are, for many people, very far down that road already, where people feel too connected to their devices. They don't want to be on them as much. You hear lots of sort of conversations about how you can combat that, and I think there is an element of, in my mind, still a kind of naivety about that. It's a strange thing to think about AI as your kind of inner critical voice. But increasingly, that's how it works most effectively, that you have this ability not just to bounce ideas off, but also for it to remember things that you have thought in the past. And the aspect of memory, I think, is a really interesting component of that. It's, for many people, disturbing, but actually, even from a kind of institutional memory perspective, it's incredibly useful, not least because you have lots of churn of employees that then you lose that history. And I think that's an even bigger risk, probably.
Is it actually good at being the inner critical voice? Because I'm sure you saw there was this big study from MIT that came out just a couple months ago now, with regard to, basically they studied students that were given SAT questions, and some students were allowed to use ChatGPT or an equivalent. Some students were not, and some students were allowed to use the internet, but not a chatbot. And the students that used the chatbot, all their answers to the same prompts all sort of ended up being pretty samey. That there might be this sort of flattening effect that's occurring in terms of creativity and sort of coming to the baseline average answer to questions.
I did see that study. I'm quite critical of the study. It reminded me a little bit of another study from a few years ago that talked about whether it's more effective as a learning device to handwrite your notes or whether you should type them. And the conclusion was that you should handwrite your notes, but the comparison was between handwriting and typing with one finger. Now, of course, anyone typing with one finger knows that's not a terribly good experience, not a very productive one, not a very efficient one either. And I think that the comparisons, and I've seen this over the last few years, students using AI in very limited ways, it comes down to whether you're using it in a critical, useful, advanced way, or whether you're just copying and pasting the first response you get. And I think certainly it's obviously apparent that if you're just doing that, then it's going to be less of a learning experience. And it's clear, like pedagogically, if the more time you spend with the material, the more likely it is that you're learning process is effective. And I think that's where we need a lot more examples of how to use AI really well. And just a very quick one. I was at a lecture a few months ago and I took notes, quite scrappy notes on my Google Keep application. I then put them into Notebook LM, very scrappy, no formatting at all. And it pushed out a 2-person podcast of that lecture with additional insights from other materials. And it was really effective. But the thing that was really effective is the time I spent in that process of doing it, which then brought me closer to the material and then deepened that learning experience. So for me, it is absolutely very easy to use any digital platform really badly, and AI is no exception. The key thing is to try to reveal some of those more nuanced ways in which you can do it really well. And it's urgent. I think we kind of help people along that journey sooner rather than later. So yeah, the comparison I think is limited by that sort of very simplistic way of using it.
The common refrain you hear in the industry here is AI is not going to take your job, but someone who knows how to use AI really well is going to take your job. That said, regarding job loss, what do you view as the likeliest outcome for the future of the labor market at large, but also particularly in an industry like media?
I think we're beginning to see elements of that already. I think that actually over the last 15 years, we've seen a transformation to some of those ways in which we make materials that are then there for advertising and for consumption. And I think that the AI era will be a continuation of that journey. It is going to be, I think, a lot harder to be really effective and really engage with consumers and make them feel a kind of warmth to your brand without that deep sort of association and involvement. So I think there is a huge transformation that is coming, but I think it's building off the last 20 years of people wanting to feel more part of something. I mean, we talk about this kind of, again, sort of sociologically, talk about sort of alienation from branding, and I think that's an element that is really critical. I think that the antidote to that is to allow people to feel part of your brand. And I remember I work a lot with the Olympic Games, and back in 2008 when the Beijing had the Olympic Games, the International Olympic Committee was still very much trying to stop people from posting photographs from the arenas online, cease and desist letters going out. And I remember talking with a VP from Getty. At that point, they were having sort of near 300 million infringements, and they went through a process where they tried to see how they could monetize their content. And I think that many of these tactics have been a really effective way to try to challenge the risk of infringements or undermining the brand by allowing people to use it. And I think that's we still see the sort of legacy of that in many different ways, but it's ultimately trying to build that brand association by participation rather than consumption, and that's a key principle.
Something that maybe you should talk to Nintendo about, because they're quite late on this. They still take down lots of YouTube videos.
Yeah, it's crazy.
But in terms of potential job losses, I think this has been sort of a pain point, especially in marketing over the past let's say 6 to 8 months. Especially, there has been quite a lot of job losses. People aren't sure how much of that is due to AI or efficiencies, but a lot of money is being invested into AI, and it's not clear to me that the return on that investment is going to come from some new product rather than greater efficiency, and greater efficiency tends to mean cost cutting, at least in the short to medium term. And you would have to cut a lot of costs to make sure that investment sort of pans out for you. So should people be concerned about job loss if they're in a white collar industry?
Absolutely. I mean, I think they should be concerned about job loss regardless of their collar color, frankly. I think there is so much that is up for grabs as a result of AI that it's critical that all sectors think and take this very seriously and understand the sort of direction of travel. I think it's the World Economic Forum puts out its report every year, and the latest one suggests more jobs being created than are lost by AI. And I think to some extent that's true. I think that is reassuring, but that doesn't get around the challenge of job transformation and the risks of redundancy. So the bigger challenge, and it's always been the case with any kind of major technological industrial transformation, the biggest problem hasn't been the sort of loss of jobs, it's the job transition for existing workforces. And I think, again, aspects of that within the creative industries we've been relatively complacent about, and thought that, yes, of course, people will still love to listen to music that humans are making rather than AI, and we already have data that shows that, in fact, sometimes people prefer the AI generated music. So I think that's a naivety that I think we rapidly need to, I mean, even things like critical skills and critical thinking. And we think, well, we still need the human in the loop to make those decisions. Completely disagree. I think that actually the human in the loop with the AI is still better than just the human in the loop. And it's important, I think, not to think that there are elements of our humanity that will just kind of stay there because they're better. I think that's very naive. The key thing for me is to try to understand how to empower creative people to make remarkable things that people think are better than just AI. And that's the challenge, not least because, again, the scale of it is huge. You take animation and, there's a huge amount of very poor quality animation that is available being consumed by lots of people. And it's partly because that content is available on YouTube, and that's where young people are going to access their animation. They're not turning on the TV. So if you're late to understanding the behavior change with where people consume, it's going to be harder to make sure that you can manage your economic transformation. So for me, it is about having a holistic sense of the societal transformation, and that means also looking beyond just your initial kind of typical kind of economic dependencies. So if you are working in animation, there's a good chance now you've got quite a lot of work working with the healthcare sector, and these are important things. I think creatively they're really exciting things, but they're also critical ways in which you can build greater resilience into those different subsectors within the creative industries.
You mentioned animators. I mean, there's an entire cottage industry that's sprung up around creating AI slop, which is almost, in some ways, to your exact point that, people are spending a lot of time on TikTok, et cetera. That's a lot of what they're seeing. It's not necessarily professionally produced content. It's a lot of this AI content that you can make very quickly. And Drew Harwell, who's a tech reporter at the Washington Post, interviewed a couple of these creators recently. And I mean, they're creating AI videos of cats doing like Olympic dives, and they're earning thousands and thousands of dollars a month off of this. I mean, it can replace their actual work. I can only imagine what someone like Neil Postman might have made of this. We really are amusing ourselves to death in a way, but does this type of content have merit relative to some of the more artistic, if you're thinking of an animator and how easily so much of that work can be replaced by some guy typing a prompt into a computer? Isn't that a huge concern?
It's a great question, because for me, it's underpinned by what we think of as being artistically really great, and how much of that also matters to different audiences. And I think on many different levels that conversation is being had. I mean, even in sports, there's sort of experiments with using motion capture to replace the boxer in the ring during the fight with an animated character that then would make the watching of that match more interesting to a 10-year-old. And of course the response is, well, they should watch the human, the athlete kind of competing, but they're not watching it. And so then there's a kind of desire to experiment with that format. And that's happening a lot, actually, in lots of different ways. So sports are reinventing themselves, creating new formats, new kind of digital physical integrations that are then trying to reach either new audiences or disrupt the kind of existing audiences. So I think there's an element of experimentation that's happening around this, but certainly what we think of artistically great has always been an incredibly, complicated conversation. And I remember sort of Woody Allen talking about how sort of comedically people over the decades have had their standards lowered systematically by worse and worse writing. And so if you write something that does well on TV, it doesn't mean anything anymore. And I think those sorts of things are always present. But what is absolutely clear across all of those decades is you still have that artistically critical, really exciting work that takes place. And I think we, to some extent, have to trust the creators, but also you have to look to the kind of the next generation of creators that are doing that. And that's always been the case with artistic practice. And so I think that we again should be optimistic that the new generation are using these technologies incredibly exciting ways, but that doesn't mean that we can take for granted that what currently is doing well will continue to do so.
Do brands run the risk of racing to the bottom at all if they were to create lots of AI advertising?
I think it's useful for big brands to look at their portfolio of content that goes out. I think you do need to have different things for different audiences. So when I think about simple Disney filters that you find on TikTok, those are performing a useful function for Disney, I think. And even allowing people to experiment with traditional forms of Disney film creation within a platform like TikTok, I think it's really exciting in many respects. I think it can bring people back to that content in ways that hopefully is really enriching. And again, to go back to our earlier conversation about the kind of loss of history because of the fast-paced moving times in which we live online, especially, I think that the really exciting prospect is that we can engage people with a whole range of different aesthetics. There's a great project that is run by a Chinese company working with the Olympic movement to colorize archival footage of the Olympic Games, which was shot in monochrome. And they're trying to then bring this back to life and see it as it was supposed to be seen. And I think those sorts of projects can give us a bit of hope that there is something richer also that's possible out there. But the investment needs to be on new artistic practices, new forms of creativity. And the concern is that if we don't invest into those pioneers who are taking the technology and pushing it to a whole new level, I think we risk jeopardizing that future.
So to your point just a minute ago, in a way, the sort of leaning into okay, maybe this is copyright infringement, right? Maybe the AI should not be allowed to recreate Disney characters, for people making TikToks. But actually leaning into that and saying, this is a person that really wants to interact with your brand. How can you use that? That might not be the worst thing in the world, is what you're kind of suggesting.
Oh, I think it's a really fantastic thing, actually, especially if you are a company with a long history and where you do have some sense of value of that history and wanting to take people on that journey. I think that's a fantastic thing to be able to do, to give them an insight into the history of animation is a wonderful opportunity. I think that certainly the feeling is that and I think that we see this quite apparently within platforms like TikTok now, that the absence of engaging is far worse than the risk of engaging. And so trying to make sure that even people know who you are is critical as being part of that world. So yes, using AI creatively to push the boundaries of what you can do is absolutely what brands should be doing, if only to make sure that they do safeguard their future. I mean, ultimately, I think the question's always been whether we can kind of put the brakes on things or not. And I think creatively, that's never been the case. And it's certainly true that you have ebbs and flows of kind of new creative formats. Some things come along for a few years and then disappear. But I think that what I've always found working with creatives is that desire to kind of explore the new creative possibility of the medium is at the heart of the entire sector. So rather than see it as a risk, it's the way in which we can do things much more effectively, but also push the boundaries of what creativity can be.
I want to ask you about ethics as well, and not just necessarily copyright, which is obviously a legal issue, and it's going through the courts, and I guess to your point, some will fight it and some might lean into it. But the ethics behind the tech of chatbots is really quite fascinating to me. Reuters last week reported that Meta's internal policies allowed chatbots to have quote-unquote sensual conversations with children, to spread health misinformation, and to help a user argue that Black people are, quote, dumber than white people, unquote. I don't even like repeating that
Wow.
in this format. Is that acceptable?
It sounds absolutely appalling, frankly. I've not read this, so I haven't read the details of what they're proposing, but it's I think that societies have always wrestled with the degree to which we allow certain ideas to be visible, to be out there in the public. And we see that debate happening, of course, online in many different ways, from the sort of approach that Elon Musk has taken with X to certainly what we're talking about in the UK around sort of online harms. I think that there's a huge chunk of that conversation that is about freedom of speech, but there's a massive, a bigger chunk that is about trying to make sure that platforms operate responsibly. And certainly one of the challenges is with these sorts of environments is how we categorize them. And we had this conversation with Twitter and other platforms a few years ago, whether we think of them as media platforms, whether we think of them as a kind of public square in many respects. And I think these are very difficult things to resolve, not least because they're often completely different categories of social experience that we've not had before. So it's not straightforward, but certainly what you've just described sounds appalling, and I'm shocked to hear it. I have to read more about this, but it's the ethics of it certainly can't be left to the platforms to decide. We certainly don't want to restrict innovation to such an extent that it cannot progress. But I think that we have the sort of beginnings of a global conversation on how to regulate AI. but it's I think in this case, it wouldn't seem to me jeopardizing the business model of AI to limit that sort of interaction.
Given the speed of change, though, do you have confidence in a global regulatory framework being, enacted in any reasonable time to sort of stop some of these potential harms? I think especially around misinformation, because and arguably have already seen this in many countries around the world where you could influence the outcome of, let's say, elections. That if you get the right regulators in place, then you don't have much regulation over the industry, right?
Yeah, and I think that it's a bit like trying to sort of resolve digital literacy. It's not a project that has an endpoint. It's not like you arrive at the policy and apply it and off we go and everything's good. I think there is certainly an ongoing monitoring that is a requirement that now is a new burden that society needs to resource. And in many respects, going back to thinking about the sort of loss of investigative journalism over the years, it's not so different from that. I think actually societies need to take seriously the need to be involved with monitoring and regulating these sorts of environments. And it's a hard sell because it's not a productive task. It's a resource that drains. So, but it's a critical part of, I think, how we need to consider the future of technology. So it is essential that we do it well, but important that we don't think that just by setting something up, that's it solved.
I suppose, how confident are you in a future where there are reasonable regulations that are enacted quickly?
I sort of turn the question around a little bit because in my mind, there are always risks. And of course, typically we think about young people especially, but there's lots of vulnerable people out there. The best way to counter vulnerability is to build resilience and at the individual level. And that for me, I think certainly we are critically failing societally, probably in most parts of the world, but certainly I think in the UK, we don't do nearly enough to build digital resilience in the young people around us. They go through school, they get an online safety form that tells them to be careful, and that's about it. So when you look at this in the round, the most effective way to protect people is to educate them, to guide them, to support them, to engage with them. And we've had sort of 20 years of a growing separation of the lives of young people in digital spaces and the development of these platforms. That needs to be completely transformed. And that's why, for me, it is about then the media industries engaging with the education sector, and not just the education sector, parents as well. It's the hard, long work that's needed to make sure you can diminish these vulnerabilities. But it's a far more effective way to do that when this is a kind of unpredictable space. And what's clear is that we have the loss of a kind of local youth clubs. We have a huge transformation to youth culture as a result of major societal transformations, and it just needs more investment. One of the most exciting things I've done over the last decade is hosting workshops on creating content for TikTok with a number of young people who are interested in esports and streaming for esports. And the creative process they went through was just deeply fascinating. But you could see how much they wanted to feel part of something. And in my mind, I remember when my son was growing up. He's 15 now, and he had after-school STEM clubs. And I think we need after-school digital skills clubs. Over a quarter of the world's schools are banning mobile phones. So there's this. I think the media industry needs to take seriously its role, not in just trying to work out how to regulate stuff, but actually to be deeply involved with the really exciting aspect of the entire sector, which is how to empower people to use these powerful devices to be part of a new innovation kind of revolution, which is, for me, the greatest opportunity that all of this brings.
How specifically would you like media companies to get involved more in education? Is it investment, or is it something else?
I think that you kind of have to look at your community and start there. So look at, if you are a media company working in a city, working in a town, how can you involve yourself with that community more widely and be part of it? We're doing that a bit in Greater Manchester, where we've got a cross university project looking at how to empower people to be kind of AI advocates, not just people that are using it, but actually to help people understand what's possible with that technology. And so being part of that community seems like such a simple thing, but it doesn't happen nearly as much as you would like. And actually involving yourself in that local community is a great starting point. So if you're a media company, wherever you are, look around what schools you can get involved with, what cultural institutions you can be part of, come to terms with just what's happening at the grassroots level in your society to both get a sense of that behavioral transformation around the content consumption, but also around what people want to enrich their lives. It's not a difficult thing, but it's just not happening enough.
You are speaking at the Future of Media Manchester event next month as we're recording this. Is the future of media in Manchester? Is investment coming to the north, and should it?
Well, I'm biased, of course. I think certainly we are absolutely the fastest growing tech sector in Europe, which is, I think, key to making sure that those things do happen. I've been in Manchester working at Salford University now for just over 10 years. And I've seen a huge amount of growth over that time, new companies coming into the region. And what's for me the most exciting part of that is the cross-sector conversations that are taking place, especially within the creative industries. So you have film, music, arts, visual arts, performance, animation coming together to work much more creatively, much more productively. So it does feel like it's entering a kind of golden age for Manchester's creative scene. But I think that it's also important that we kind of keep our eyes on what's outside too. So I'd certainly encourage people to think about what's going on in Manchester, but we have to think globally as well, and we understand those transformations. Not least because actually, when you look at the populations of places, there, it's global. You have to kind of think about the international scene and understand what's happening around us as well.
Final question: apart from AI, what's a nascent piece of technology that marketers specifically should be keeping close tabs on?
Wow, where to start? I suppose there's interesting work depending on which sector. Like if you look at healthcare, there's interesting things happening there around ingestible technologies, wearable technologies. I think for me, what strikes me is still critical. I always have this sort of schizophrenia between looking at the really high-end, cutting-edge stuff that's really transforming how we think about technology. I mean, I even remember with Google Glass, one of the interesting features of it was you could take a photograph by winking your eye. And for me, that was such an interesting kind of design transformation after sort of 100 years of clicking it with a finger, that I think those are fascinating ways in which technology is changing how we relate to it. But then I also think about the fact that the NHS is still struggling on fundamental digital things like email. And so for me, the right way to think about the future is yes, to adopt Tim Berners-Lee's statement, this is for everyone, but add the appendage, but it isn't yet. and actually just remember that the people that are absent from this is actually the greatest strength for how we can really adopt and innovate in the future. There are too many people absent from this conversation about innovation. And if we can harness those much more effectively, there are still yet unimaginable things that could be achieved.
Well, that's a great way to end it. Andy, it's been a total pleasure, and I really look forward to hearing your talk at the Future Media Manchester event.
Thanks so much.
Thank you for listening to the Media Leader podcast. Our executive producer is me, Jack Benjamin. Special thanks to our production partner, TriSonic. You can find all our episodes on the podcast platform of your choice or on our website at uk.themedialeader.com. But do please remember to subscribe to be notified of our next episode. You can also subscribe to our newsletter at The Media Leader to receive daily coverage of all the biggest news stories in media and advertising. From all of us at The Media Leader, I'm Jack Benjamin. See you next time.